Black lawyer gets mistaken for defendant again. Judge's reaction when she shows 30-year record. Dives into a high-stakes courtroom drama where systemic bias collides with a legacy of excellence. What happens when a judge's assumptions are challenged by one of the most successful lawyers in the state? Will Rachel's poise and unmatched record force accountability, or will injustice prevail? Before we dive into this powerful story, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping tales of resilience and redemption. The courtroom buzzed with energy as Rachel Davis pushed through the heavy double doors, her polished leather briefcase in one hand and a stack of meticulously organized files in the other. Her every step echoed through the room, the sound deliberate and commanding. She had walked into countless courtrooms over her 3-decade-long career, but this case, this moment, felt heavier than usual. She paused near the plaintiff's table, taking a moment to survey the room. The gallery was packed, with every seat filled by reporters, spectators, and those desperate for a glimpse of the proceedings. Her opponent, Mitchell Langston, a younger, cocky attorney with a reputation for underhanded tactics, smirked at her from across the aisle. Rachel barely acknowledged him. She had faced men like him her entire career, ones who underestimated her until it was too late. Rachel placed her briefcase on the table, clicking it open with precision. She began arranging her files, meticulously aligning them, as her young legal assistant, Malik, stood beside her, nervously clutching a notepad. "You good, Malik?" Rachel asked, her voice low and firm, though not unkind. Malik nodded quickly, swallowing hard. "Yeah, I'm ready. Just a lot of eyes out there today." Rachel's lips curved into a small smile. "Don't worry about the crowd. The only eyes that matter are the judges." The two exchanged a glance, and Malik's shoulders seemed to ease slightly under her quiet reassurance. Rachel had seen his potential the moment she interviewed him. He was smart, eager, and passionate about justice, but she also knew he was still learning how to navigate the weight of systemic bias, a burden she had carried her entire career. Rachel glanced toward the bench. The judge had yet to arrive, but the clerk, the bailiff, and other courtroom staff moved about, preparing for the session. She caught snippets of hushed conversations from the gallery, whispers that she had grown used to over the years. "Is she the lawyer? She looks more like she's here to testify. I thought Langston would have someone more experienced to face." Rachel's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before she took a calming breath. She had no time for distractions, not today. Suddenly, the doors to the judge's chambers opened, and Judge Carson, a man who looked to be in his early 40s and new to the bench, strode out. He adjusted his robe with an air of self-importance, glancing briefly around the room before taking his seat. His eyes settled on Rachel as she stood by the plaintiff's table, flipping through her notes. "Excuse me," the judge said abruptly, his voice cutting through the courtroom's chatter. You're sitting in the wrong spot. The defendant's table is over there." The room went still. For a moment, Rachel thought she had misheard him. Her head tilted slightly and her sharp brown eyes met his. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "I'm Rachel Davis, counsel for the plaintiff." The judge blinked, his brows furrowing in confusion. "Oh," he said, clearing his throat awkwardly. "My mistake." The murmurs in the gallery swelled to a low rumble. Rachel remained stone-faced, though Malik visibly tensed beside her. Langston, ever the opportunist, chuckled softly, shaking his head as though the mix-up amused him. Rachel ignored him. She had learned long ago to pick her battles carefully. Instead, she addressed the judge with professional composure. "I'd like to proceed with the case if Your Honor is ready." Judge Carson's face flushed, and he nodded stiffly. "Of course, proceed." Malik leaned toward Rachel, whispering under his breath, "How do you stay so calm?" Rachel's gaze didn't waver as she whispered back, "Because I've been here before, and I'll be here again." As the proceedings began, Rachel's focus never faltered. She presented her opening arguments with the same meticulous clarity and undeniable logic that had made her a legal powerhouse. Her voice resonated with authority, each word cutting through the courtroom like a scalpel. But she couldn't ignore the tension that hung over the room. Judge Carson's demeanor was still stiff, his gaze a mix of embarrassment and discomfort whenever he addressed her. His questions about her arguments came off sharper than those posed to Langston. Rachel knew it wasn't just rookie nerves. It was the unspoken, unconscious bias that had dogged her career from day one. Malik scribbled notes furiously as Rachel cross-examined the first witness, a key figure whose testimony would either solidify or unravel their case. Rachel's questions were pointed and precise, her tone firm but never aggressive. The witness faltered under her scrutiny, his answers increasingly inconsistent. Rachel stepped back from the stand, satisfied. She returned to the plaintiff's table and whispered to Malik, "That's a crack. We'll widen it during rebuttal." Malik nodded eagerly, clearly in awe of her skill. But the momentary satisfaction was short-lived. "Ms. Davis," Judge Carson interrupted, his tone edging toward condescension, "you're taking an awful lot of time with your questioning. Let's try to keep things moving." Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. She glanced at Langston, who smirked knowingly. He had spent twice as long with his opening witness, yet the judge hadn't said a word to him. "Understood, Your Honor," Rachel replied smoothly, her voice betraying no irritation. She turned back to Malik. "Adjust the timeline for the next witness." He hesitated. "But just do it," Rachel said firmly. The day's session ended with an air of anticipation. As the courtroom emptied, Rachel began packing her files into her briefcase. Malik lingered, fidgeting with his pen. "Miss Davis," he said finally, "doesn't it bother you, the way he treated you?" Rachel straightened, her gaze steady as she regarded him. "Of course it does," she said. "But you don't win battles by getting distracted. You win by being prepared, by being better." Malik looked down, absorbing her words. Rachel placed a hand on his shoulder, her voice softening. "Don't let their bias define you, Malik. Show them who you are, and when they underestimate you, let them." As they walked out of the courtroom, Rachel felt the weight of the day pressing on her shoulders. But she held her head high, her stride unwavering. This was just another day in the fight, a fight she had been winning for 3 decades. The battle wasn't over, but Rachel Davis had never been one to back down. The courtroom settled into an uneasy rhythm as the trial continued the following day. Rachel arrived early, as always, meticulously preparing her arguments while Malik reviewed the day's lineup of witnesses. The tension from the previous day lingered in the air, a reminder of Judge Carson's blatant misstep. Rachel's sharp brown eyes scanned the room as she adjusted her glasses. Langston, her opposing counsel, sat at his table, casually flipping through a legal pad. His confidence oozed across the aisle, but Rachel knew it was a facade. She had seen it too many times before, a lawyer relying more on theatrics than skill. "Malik," she said without looking up from her notes, "make sure the court reporter has a copy of our timeline for witness questioning. We need every detail to align." "Already done," Malik replied, his voice steadier than it had been the day before. His admiration for Rachel had only grown after watching her dismantle the defense's first witness with precision. The courtroom doors opened and Judge Carson entered with his usual air of formality. As he took his seat, his gaze briefly landed on Rachel before shifting away. Rachel noticed the flicker of discomfort in his expression. The memory of his initial mistake clearly still haunted him, but rather than addressing it directly, he seemed determined to compensate with hypercritical oversight of her every move. Rachel leaned toward Malik as the judge adjusted his robe. "Watch carefully today," she whispered. "Bias often hides behind the guise of professionalism." Malik nodded, his notepad ready to capture every detail. The day's first witness was a key figure for the defense, a former employee of the plaintiff's company. Langston's questioning was predictably theatrical, laced with innuendos aimed at undermining Rachel's case. The witness, a middle-aged man named Richard Kane, was visibly uneasy under the scrutiny, but followed Langston's lead as best he could. When Rachel's turn to cross-examine came, she rose from her chair with an unhurried confidence. She approached the stand, her heels clicking on the polished floor, each step calculated to command attention. "Mr. Kane," she began, her voice calm and steady, "you mentioned earlier that you left the plaintiff's company due to what you described as unfair treatment. Could you elaborate on that?" Kane shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward Langston. "Well, I didn't feel like my contributions were valued." Rachel nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his words. "And by unfair treatment, do you mean that you were denied promotions, raises, or other opportunities?" "Not exactly," Kane replied, fidgeting. "It was more about the overall atmosphere." Rachel stepped closer to the stand, her tone softening. "I understand. Workplace culture can be challenging, but Mr. Kane, isn't it true that you were reprimanded multiple times for inappropriate conduct with colleagues?" Langston shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance." Judge Carson looked at Rachel, his expression stern. "Ms. Davis, explain how this line of questioning pertains to the case." Rachel met his gaze without hesitation. "Your Honor, the defense has painted Mr. Kane as a credible witness to discredit my client's claims. Establishing his credibility, or lack thereof, is directly relevant." There was a pause. The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Overruled. Proceed." Langston sank back into his chair, visibly annoyed. Rachel turned back to Kane, who now looked visibly shaken. "Mr. Kane," she continued, "isn't it also true that you were terminated for repeated violations of company policy, including harassment complaints filed by 3 separate employees?" Kane's face reddened. I don't recall." "Let me refresh your memory," Rachel said smoothly, retrieving a document from her table. "This is a copy of your termination letter, which clearly outlines the reasons for your dismissal. Would you like me to read it aloud?" The gallery murmured as Kane fumbled for a response. Langston tried to interject again, but Judge Carson silenced him with a raised hand. Rachel pressed on, her questions slicing through Kane's defenses until his credibility was in tatters. When Rachel finally returned to her seat, Malik leaned over, whispering, "You made that look easy." "It never is," Rachel replied quietly, "but preparation makes it look that way." As the day wore on, the subtle biases of the courtroom began to manifest more openly. Judge Carson frequently interrupted Rachel's questioning, often under the guise of procedural corrections. Langston, on the other hand, was allowed to ramble without interruption, his arguments laced with thinly veiled jabs at Rachel's competence. At one point, as Rachel presented a key piece of evidence, a timeline of emails proving the defendant's misconduct, Judge Carson interrupted her mid-sentence. "Ms. Davis," he said, his tone clipped, "this is highly irregular. Did you follow proper procedure to admit this evidence?" Rachel paused, holding the judge's gaze. "Yes, Your Honor. This evidence was submitted to the court and opposing counsel 2 weeks ago, as per the rules of discovery." Langston cleared his throat, feigning confusion. "I don't recall receiving those documents." Rachel's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "If opposing counsel is unable to locate his copy, I'd be happy to provide another. Transparency has never been an issue on my side of the case." The gallery's murmurs grew louder. Judge Carson hesitated, clearly torn between supporting Langston's claim and maintaining his own credibility. Finally, he sighed. "Very well." Rachel's composure never wavered, but Malik could see the tension in her clenched fists as she returned to her seat. "They're testing you," he whispered. "They always do," she replied, "but they'll regret it." The turning point of the day came during Rachel's questioning of the plaintiff, a small business owner named Teresa Hill. Teresa's testimony was crucial, as it painted a vivid picture of the defendant's calculated attempts to undermine her business. Rachel guided Teresa through her story with care, ensuring her voice was heard, despite Langston's constant objections. As Teresa described the financial strain and emotional toll of the defendant's actions, Rachel noticed a subtle shift in the room. The gallery grew quieter, the audience leaning forward in their seats. Even Judge Carson seemed to listen more intently, his critical demeanor softening slightly. When Langston attempted to discredit Teresa with leading questions during cross-examination, Rachel objected with a force that left no room for debate. "Your Honor," she said, rising to her feet, "this line of questioning is not only irrelevant but blatantly disrespectful to my client. I urge the court to rein it in." Judge Carson's hesitation was brief, but for the first time he sided with Rachel without argument. "Sustained." Rachel caught a flicker of surprise in Langston's eyes before he returned to his seat, his confidence visibly shaken. By the end of the session, Rachel had regained control of the courtroom's narrative. As the gallery emptied, Malik turned to her, his expression a mix of awe and concern. "You really think Judge Carson is coming around?" he asked. Rachel smiled faintly, closing her briefcase. "It's not about him, Malik. It's about the truth. And when you wield it with precision, it's hard for even the most biased people to ignore." As they left the courtroom, the day's battles left Rachel tired but resolute. The fight was far from over, but she knew she was winning, not just the case, but the war for respect and justice. The final day of the trial arrived with a tension that hung thick in the courtroom air. Every seat was filled, the gallery buzzing with anticipation. Rachel Davis sat at the plaintiff's table, her polished demeanor as unshakable as ever, though she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Today, she would deliver the closing argument that could make or break her client's case, and leave a lasting impression on a courtroom that had doubted her from the start. Malik fidgeted beside her, his notepad filled with pages of detailed observations. He looked to Rachel for reassurance, and she gave him a brief nod. "You've done good work," she whispered. "Now we finish this." Across the aisle, Mitchell Langston smirked, flipping through his closing statement. The smug confidence radiating from him was palpable, but Rachel had learned long ago that overconfidence was a weakness she could exploit. Judge Carson entered the room, his expression neutral yet tinged with something that hadn't been there before. A hint of respect. He called the court to order, and the proceedings began. Langston rose to give his closing argument, pacing dramatically as he spun a narrative designed to paint Rachel's client as an opportunist. His words were slick, his delivery polished, but Rachel noticed the cracks in his performance. His argument relied on conjecture, and his attempts to discredit Rachel's evidence lacked substance. When Langston finished, he returned to his seat with a satisfied grin, certain he had done enough. Rachel rose slowly, her every movement deliberate. She stepped to the center of the courtroom, her gaze sweeping across the gallery before settling on the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and commanding, "you've heard a lot over the past few days. My esteemed colleague has worked tirelessly to distract you with conjecture and baseless accusations, but I urge you to focus on the facts." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "The facts tell a very different story. The facts show that my client, Teresa Hill, is a hard-working small business owner who built her company from the ground up. The facts show that the defendant systematically and deliberately sabotaged her efforts, not out of necessity, but out of greed." Rachel's voice rose slightly, filled with quiet conviction. "This case isn't just about financial loss, it's about justice. It's about holding people accountable for their actions, no matter how powerful they may think they are." As she continued, Rachel's tone shifted, becoming more personal. "Throughout this trial, I've seen the same tired tactics I've faced my entire career. I've been underestimated, scrutinized, and second-guessed, not because of my abilities, but because of what I look like. And while I've grown accustomed to this treatment, I refuse to let it define me or my client." Judge Carson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Rachel pressed on, her gaze unwavering. Bias has no place in a courtroom. Justice must be blind to prejudice, and it is our duty, your duty, to ensure that justice prevails. She turned to the jury, her voice softening. I ask you to consider the evidence, to look beyond the distractions, and to stand for what's right. My client deserves justice, and this courtroom deserves the truth. Rachel returned to her seat, the room silent except for the faint scratching of the court reporter's keys. Malik leaned toward her, his voice a whisper. That was incredible. Rachel allowed herself a small smile. Now we wait. The jury deliberated for hours, the tension in the courtroom growing with each passing minute. Rachel sat quietly, her hands folded on the table, her expression unreadable. Malik, on the other hand, was a bundle of nerves, tapping his pen against his notepad until Rachel gently placed her hand over his. Patience, she said simply. When the jury finally returned, the foreperson handed a piece of paper to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Carson. The judge read the verdict silently, his face giving nothing away, before addressing the courtroom. In the case of Hill versus Radford Enterprises, he announced, the jury finds in favor of the plaintiff. The gallery erupted in murmurs, a mix of surprise and satisfaction rippling through the room. Teresa Hill gasped, covering her mouth with her hands as tears filled her eyes. Rachel placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. You did it, Teresa whispered, her voice trembling. We did it, Rachel corrected. This was your fight. I just gave it a voice. Langston slumped in his chair, his smug demeanor shattered. He shot a glare at Rachel, but she didn't so much as glance in his direction. Her focus was on her client, on the justice they had achieved together. As the courtroom emptied, Judge Carson remained behind, his robe draped over one arm. He approached Rachel, his expression unusually earnest. Mr. Davis, he began hesitantly, I owe you an apology. Rachel raised an eyebrow, her composure unwavering. For what, Your Honor? For my conduct earlier in this trial, he admitted, his voice low. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and I was wrong. Watching you in this courtroom has been a lesson in humility and professionalism. I'll strive to do better. Rachel studied him for a moment, then extended her hand. Thank you, Judge Carson. Acknowledging bias is the first step to overcoming it. They shook hands, and Rachel left the courtroom with her head held high. Outside, the late afternoon sun bathed the courthouse steps in golden light. Teresa, Malik, and Rachel stood together, the weight of the trial finally lifting. Miss Davis, Malik said, his voice filled with admiration. How do you keep doing it? Facing this kind of resistance every time? Rachel looked at him, her expression softening. Because every win matters, Malik. Not just for my clients, but for everyone who's ever been underestimated. For people like you, who will carry this fight forward long after I'm gone. Teresa hugged Rachel tightly, her gratitude evident in the tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered. You've changed my life. Richie smiled, her heart full. That's why I do what I do. As they walked down the steps together, Rachel felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The fight was never easy, but it was always worth it, and as long as there was injustice to confront, she would continue to stand tall, a beacon of resilience and hope.